The gavel didn't just strike the wood, it struck my soul. A final hollow thud that echoed through the mahogany-lined vacuum of the courtroom. Marcus Thorne sat 3 feet away, draped in a $3,000 suit that seemed to repel the very air of the room. He didn't even look at me. To him, I wasn't Elias Vance, the man who had spent 3 decades calculating the load-bearing capacities of the state's most iconic bridges. I was just an obstacle, a line item to be liquidated in a high-stakes game of eminent domain. Foreclosure absolute, the judge intoned, her voice devoid of the weight of the life she was ending. With a single stroke of a Mont Blanc pen, 30 years of blueprints, sweat-stained field notes, and reinforced concrete were erased. Thorne finally leaned over, the sharp, clinical scent of his expensive cologne cutting through the stale, dusty air of the court like a scalpel. "Don't take it personally, Elias," he whispered, his voice as smooth and cold as polished marble. "You were a relic, a great engineer for a world that doesn't exist anymore. The world doesn't need bridges that last a century. It needs luxury condos that sell in a week. You're standing on my dirt, and I don't like clutter." By noon, the locksmiths were at my door, their heavy boots thumping on the hardwood floors my father had laid. By 1, my truck, the last tangible piece of my identity, was being hoisted onto a repo crane, its tires screeching in protest against the asphalt. By 2, I was standing on the curb of the life I used to lead, clutching a single canvas duffel bag, my fingers numb and my heart feeling like a pile of jagged glass shards. The Montana wind found me before I could even process the silence. It wasn't just a breeze. It was a physical entity, a living, breathing predator that had been crouching in the shadows of the crazy mountains, waiting for the exact moment I became vulnerable. It roared down the valley, carrying the smell of ancient ice and the metallic tang of an approaching apocalypse. They call this the Big Sky. But today, the sky was a suffocating shroud of bruised purple and charcoal grey, pressing down on the earth until I felt like I was being buried alive while still upright. I started walking. I had no destination, no map, and no reason to stop, so I let the wind push me north. I wanted to be as far as possible from the glass towers Thorne was erecting on the bones of my reputation. My boots, which had once felt like sturdy armor against the mud of 100 construction sites, now felt like lead weights as I trudged toward the dying heart of Bittersweet Creek. Bittersweet Creek wasn't a town so much as it was a scar on the Montana landscape, a jagged collection of boarded-up windows, sagging porches, and the rusting skeletons of a silver mining boom that had bled out before the Great Depression. The people here didn't look you in the eye. They looked at your hands, checking for the presence of a tool or a weapon, looking for anything worth the effort of a confrontation. I reached the edge of the township just as the sun began its final pathetic retreat behind the peaks, casting long, distorted shadows that looked like grasping fingers across the crusty snow. My breath hitched in my lungs, coming out in thick grey plumes that the wind instantly snatched away and tore to pieces. I felt the first sharp bite of frostbite nipping at the edges of my ears, a high-voltage electric sting that signaled the beginning of the shutdown. If I didn't find a hole to crawl into within the hour, the Montana winter would claim me as just another piece of forgotten debris. I stumbled into Miller's Hardware and Feed, just as the rusted bell above the door gave its final, mournful chime. The closed forever sign was already being taped to the cracked glass. Inside, the air was a thick mixture of cedar dust, old oil, and the sour smell of failure. The shelves, which I remembered being packed with the heartbeat of the community, were stripped to the bone. All that remained were ghost rings of dust where buckets and saws used to sit. A man with skin like wrinkled parchment and eyes that had seen too many winters watched me from behind a scarred counter. "Sale's over, son," he croaked, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "I'm just crating the scraps for the auctioneers. Nothing left for you here." I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the only thing I had left in the world, a single, crumpled $10 bill, the total sum of the Vance estate. I looked around the room, my engineer's brain reflexively scanning the remaining junk, looking for a sign, a structural miracle in a heap of trash. In a bin near the back, half buried under a grease-stained tarp, I saw the dull glint of steel. I pulled out a box. It was heavy, real, structural weight. I opened the lid. 5 pounds of 4-inch structural screws, triple-coated, star drive, rated for shear force that would snap a standard framing nail like a dry twig. These weren't for birdhouses. These were for securing timber in the face of a hurricane. How much? I asked, my voice cracking and raw from the intake of freezing air. The old man looked at the box, then at my shaking hands, then at the duffel bag at my feet. He saw the desperation, but he also saw the way I held those screws, like a man holding a lifeline. Found them in the basement storage today. Probably shouldn't even be on the inventory, he said, sighing as he looked at the darkening window. Give me the $10 and get out of here before the sheriff comes by to lock the gate. And find a roof, kid. The radio says this one's going to be a record breaker. I didn't hesitate. I slid my last $10 across the worn wood of the counter. He took it without a word, and I stepped back out into the screaming teeth of the blizzard, clutching that cardboard box to my chest like it was a chest of Spanish gold. To anyone else, it was $10 of scrap metal. To me, it was the skeleton of a future. I didn't head for the shelters in the next town over. I didn't seek out the charity of the church or the cold comfort of the police station. I went down. I climbed over the rusted guardrail of the bridge I'd helped survey 20 years ago, descending into the ravine of Bittersweet Creek. It was the town's unofficial graveyard for the things it wanted to forget. Rotted timber from collapsed barns, rusted sheets of corrugated tin, discarded tires, and the splintered remains of a century of failed dreams. The wind howled through the gulch, a high-pitched mocking scream that sounded exactly like Marcus Thorne's laughter in that courtroom. I pushed through a wall of dead brush until I found a spot where a massive, ancient cedar had fallen years ago. Its roots ripped from the earth, creating a natural, if precarious, lean-to against a granite outcrop. The ground was littered with the refuse of the valley, broken shipping pallets, scraps of waterlogged plywood, and jagged lengths of toot fours that had somehow avoided the worst of the rot. The temperature was plummeting now, the mercury retreating as if in terror. My pocket thermometer read 12 below zero, and the core of the storm hadn't even crossed the border yet. Most men would have looked at this ravine and seen a trash heap. They would have seen a place to die. But as I knelt in the frozen mud, my hands trembling as I pried open that box of structural screws, I didn't see garbage. I saw tension loads. I saw compression points. I saw the undeniable physics of survival. Thorne had taken my money, my home, my professional standing, and my pride, but he had failed to take the one thing he was too arrogant to value: the math. I looked at the twisted metal and the grey, weathered wood scattered around me like the bones of a giant. I looked at the 5 pounds of steel in my hand. Then, I looked up at the blackening sky as the first true flakes of the great white began to fall. The storm the news was already calling unsurvivable for anyone caught outdoors. I didn't just have a plan. I had a masterpiece in my mind, a structure that would defy the very laws of the Montana winter. I gripped the first screw, the freezing metal burning a mark into my palm, and I began to build. The shovel blade didn't slice the earth. It shrieked against it. The ground in the ravine was a composite of glacial till and frozen silt, packed as hard as low-grade concrete by a century of Montana winters. Every strike sent a jarring vibration up the wooden handle, through my wrists, and deep into my shoulder sockets, a rhythmic punishment for my defiance. I wasn't just digging a hole, I was excavating a sarcophagus for my old life. The dugout technique is an ancient wisdom often forgotten in the age of central heating and fiberglass insulation. By carving the living space 3 feet into the earth, I was tapping into the planet's steady thermal heart. Down there, beneath the frost line, the temperature would hover at a constant, merciful 55 degrees, regardless of the Arctic hell screaming above the rim of the gulch. It was the only way to survive a storm that the weather service was now calling a once-in-a-generation event. I worked with a feverish, mechanical precision. My breath came in ragged, crystalline bursts that coated my beard in a fine layer of rime. I used the massive fallen cedar as my primary structural anchor. Its trunk was nearly 3 feet in diameter, a horizontal pillar of dense, rot-resistant heartwood that had already proven its strength by surviving a century of growth before the wind finally brought it down. I cleared the frozen debris from its base, exposing the raw, reddish-brown bark that smelled of ancient forests and sharp resin. This tree wasn't just a log, it was my ridge beam, my foundation, and my shield. I wedged 2x4s I'd scavenged from a collapsed shed into the gaps between the cedar and the granite outcrop, creating a series of triangular trusses. The triangle is the strongest shape in the universe, an engineer's prayer in wood and steel. The screws I'd bought for $10 were the only things holding this desperate geometry together. Each time I set the star drive bit and leaned my weight into the handle, the sound was a high-pitched, satisfying zip-clack as the threads bit into the frozen timber. These weren't standard hardware store junk, they were structural titans. I could feel the way they pulled the disparate pieces of wood together, closing the gaps with a force that made the grain groan in protest. The wood didn't just meet, it fused. I was creating a tension-loaded web of debris, a structure that didn't just sit on the ground, but bit into it. The sound of the engine reached me before the lights did. It wasn't the chugging, honest rumble of a work truck. It was the refined, predatory whine of a high-displacement V8, the kind found in vehicles that cost more than most people's homes. 2 piercing beams of LED white light cut through the swirling snow, turning the falling flakes into a horizontal blizzard of diamonds. A charcoal grey Range Rover, its tyres churning through the mud and slush of the upper ravine path, came to a stop 20 yards above my dugout. The headlights remained on, pinning me in their glare like an escaped convict. The door opened, and the interior light spilled out, a warm, amber glow that looked like a different dimension of comfort. Marcus Thorne stepped out, his feet encased in polished ostrich skin boots that looked absurdly out of place in the muck. He didn't even bother to close the door, letting the climate-controlled air bleed out into the freezing night. Behind him, Miller, the county building inspector, climbed out of the passenger side, clutching a clipboard to his chest like a shield. Miller looked miserable, his face pale and pinched against the cold, but Thorne looked like he was attending a gallery opening. "My God, Elias!" Thorne called out, his voice amplified by the natural acoustics of the ravine. He didn't shout. He projected, a man used to being heard over the noise of progress. "I knew you were stubborn, but I didn't think you'd actually crawl into a ditch to die. It's poetic, in a pathetic sort of way. The great bridge builder, living in a hole with the rest of the rats." I didn't stop working. I kept my back to him, my fingers numbly fumbling for the next screw in the cardboard box. The cold was a physical weight now, pressing against my spine, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me shiver. "Mr. Vance," Miller squeaked, his voice cracking, "we've been looking for you. This site is a violation of approximately 47 county codes. It's an unpermitted structure on public land, and frankly, it's a public safety hazard. You can't stay here." Thorne laughed, a sharp, barking sound that was instantly swallowed by the wind. "Safety hazard? Miller, look at it. It's a trash cabin. A pile of sticks and rust. He's building a monument to his own obsolescence." He began to descend the slope, his expensive boots sliding and ruining the leather, but he didn't seem to care. He stopped 5 feet from the edge of my excavation, looking down at me with a mixture of amusement and genuine disgust. "I'm here to do you a favor, Elias, a final act of professional courtesy." He reached into the breast pocket of his wool coat, cashmere, undoubtedly, and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored envelope. He held it out, the wind whipping at the edges. When I didn't take it, he simply dropped it. It landed in the frozen mud at the edge of my dugout, the white paper instantly soaking up the grey filth. "That's a final eviction from the county notice," Thorne said. his voice dropping to a low, cold vibration. "Not just the property, Elias, the county. You're a vagrant now, a nuisance. I've already bought the development rights for this entire ravine. By next spring, this will be the 8th hole of the Bittersweet Creek Golf and Spa. Your little cabin will be under 10 feet of manicured turf. You have until dawn to clear out of the ravine, or Miller here has the sheriff on standby to remove you forcibly." "It's going to snow 3 feet tonight, Marcus," I said, my voice sounding like gravel grinding together. I finally turned to look at him, my eyes stinging from the wind. "You're sending a man into a blizzard with nowhere to go." Thorne shrugged, a slow, deliberate movement. "Choices, Elias. You chose to fight the future. The future doesn't owe you a roof. Now, if you'll excuse me, Miller and I have a dinner reservation at the club. The prime rib is supposed to be excellent tonight." He turned on his heel, signaling Miller to follow him back to the warmth of the Rover. As they reached the vehicle, the first true hammer blow of the storm struck. It wasn't just a gust. It was a wall of air, a concentrated blast of kinetic energy that roared down the canyon like a freight train. The Range Rover, for all its 3 tons of luxury engineering, rocked visibly on its suspension. I saw Thorne stumble, his hand flying out to grab the door handle for stability. The wind screamed through the valley, tearing the eviction notice from the mud and shredding it against the rocks in a matter of seconds. But down in the dugout, tucked against the cedar and the stone, I felt nothing. Not a tremor, not a vibration. The frame I had built, anchored by the $10 screws and the geometry of the earth, didn't move an inch. I looked up through the skeletal roof of my structure, watching the snow lash horizontally across the opening, and I smiled. Thorne had the luxury, but I had the physics. And in Montana, when the great white comes for you, luxury is just a fancy way to freeze to death. I picked up the shovel and went back to work. I had 6 more feet of earth to move before the real storm arrived. The darkness that followed Thorne's departure wasn't just an absence of light. It was a physical weight, a thick, suffocating velvet that seemed to swallow the very sound of my shovel. The wind had graduated from a roar to a high-pitched metallic shriek, the kind of sound a bridge makes just before the tension cables snap. I knew the rhythm of this land. I knew that this was merely the overture. The real symphony of the storm was still miles out, gathering strength over the divide, preparing to erase everything in its path. I needed more than just a dugout and a cedar log. I needed a shell. I needed a way to keep the heat in and the death out. I began to forage deeper into the ravine, moving by the erratic, dying light of a wind-up flashlight I'd found in my duffel. The beam was weak, a flickering yellow eye that barely penetrated the swirling white chaos. My boots crunched over frozen metal and shattered wood, the detritus of a century of abandonment. I moved like a scavenger, my eyes scanning for the specific geometry of utility. I found a rusted refrigerator, its door hanging by a single hinge. Useless. I found a stack of rotted plywood that crumbled like damp cake under my touch. Useless. Then, my foot struck something that didn't yield. It didn't crunch, and it didn't snap. It rang, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the sole of my boot and up into my teeth. I knelt, the wind trying to peel the jacket off my back, and began to clear the snow with my gloved hands. Beneath the white shroud lay a massive rectangular shape, half buried in the silt. As I cleared more of the debris, my heart began to hammer against my ribs. It was a beam, but not just any beam. It was a 12-foot length of reclaimed Douglas fir, 12 inches thick, treated with a dark, pungent creosote that had preserved it against the rot for decades. And bolted to its side, held by massive rusted iron plates, was a secondary treasure, a series of heavy industrial-grade glass panes, still encased in their steel window frames. I recognized the markings stamped into the iron plates. These weren't just scraps. These were components from the old Miller's Crossing Bridge, a project I'd consulted on 25 years ago. The bridge had been decommissioned and replaced by one of Thorne's efficient concrete spans, but it seemed the contractors had been lazy. Instead of hauling the heavy timber to a proper disposal site, They dumped the heart of the old bridge into the ravine, letting the earth swallow the evidence of their corner cutting. The glass was the real miracle. It was wired safety glass, 3/4 of an inch thick, designed to withstand the vibration of heavy trucks and the impact of wind-blown debris. In the world of survival, glass is a liability. It breaks, it leaks heat, it shatters under pressure. But this glass, this was armor. It was the eyes of my cabin. If I could extract these pieces, I wouldn't just be sitting in a dark hole. I would have a way to harness the sun, even the weak filtered light of a Montana winter. The extraction was a nightmare of physics and brute force. I had no crane, no winch, and no help. I had only my shovel, my crowbar, and the desperate adrenaline of a man who knows his life depends on the next hour. I used the crowbar as a lever, wedging it under the edge of the timber and using a flat rock as a fulcrum. The wood groaned, a deep ancestral sound of protest, but it moved. Each inch was a battle. The wind lashed at me, freezing the sweat on my brow until it felt like a crown of thorns. My muscles screamed, the fibers of my back feeling like they were being pulled through a wire drawplate. I shifted the first window frame, the steel edges biting into my palms even through the heavy leather gloves. It was heavier than I'd anticipated, a solid 100 pounds of industrial history. I dragged it back toward the dugout, the metal screeching against the frozen stones like a wounded animal. I repeated the process, trip after trip, moving with a mechanical, obsessive focus. I didn't think about the cold. I didn't think about Thorn. I didn't think about the fact that I was a 60-year-old man dragging tons of industrial waste through a blizzard. I thought only of the load-bearing capacity of that Douglas fir beam and the thermal properties of wired glass. By the time I had the 3 main window frames and the primary beam positioned near my excavation, the flashlight was nothing more than a dim orange glow. The storm had reached a new level of intensity. The snow was no longer falling. It was an atmospheric river of ice, moving horizontally at 60 miles per hour. I could no longer see the rim of the ravine. I could barely see my own hands. The world had vanished, replaced by a screaming white void. I slid back into the dugout, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. I was on the verge of hypothermia. I could feel the telltale lethargy beginning to cloud my mind, the dangerous temptation to just close my eyes for a minute. I forced myself to move. I grabbed my box of $10 screws and my driver. I positioned the Douglas fir beam across the top of my excavation, perpendicular to the fallen cedar. It was a perfect fit. The 2 massive timbers formed a T, the strongest structural configuration for a roof. I set the first screw into the iron plate of the window frame, aligning it with the cedar trunk. The star drive bit locked in, and I squeezed the trigger of my old, battered cordless drill. The battery was dying in the cold, the motor whining with effort, but the screw bit. It pulled the steel frame flush against the wood, the seal so tight it was nearly airtight. I repeated the process, mounting the 3 glass panes into the front of my structure, facing south. Even in the darkness, I could feel the change. The wind, which had been a constant invasive presence, was suddenly muffled. The interior of the dugout grew still. I sat there in the dark, my back against the cold earth, listening to the storm lash against the wired glass. It was a rhythmic, violent sound, but it stayed out there. Inside, the air began to settle. The ambient heat of the earth, that steady 55 degrees I'd banked on, began to accumulate in the small, enclosed space. It wasn't warm, not yet, but the killing edge of the wind was gone. I reached out and touched the glass. It was cold, but it was solid. I had found the heart of my cabin in the graveyard of my past. I closed my eyes for just a second, the sound of the storm turning into a low, distant hum. I had the bones. Now, I needed the fire. The hunger hit me then, a sharp, twisting pain in my gut that reminded me I hadn't eaten since the courtroom. But more than hunger, there was the thirst. In a blizzard, water is everywhere and nowhere. You can melt snow, but the energy required to turn ice into liquid is a luxury I couldn't afford to waste. I needed a system. I needed an engineering solution for the two basic requirements of life: hydration and heat. I reached into my duffel bag and pulled out my last remaining assets. A length of copper tubing I'd salvaged from a renovation project years ago, a small, portable butane stove with a single canister, and a collapsible 5-gallon water bladder. It wasn't enough to survive a week, let alone a month-long siege. I looked around my small, shadowed sanctuary. The light from my dying flashlight caught the glint of the rusted iron plates on the bridge timber. My mind began to trace the lines of a thermal siphon. If I could create a rocket mass heater using the materials in the ravine, I could stay warm on a handful of twigs. And if I integrated the copper tubing into the exhaust, I could have a continuous supply of hot, sterilized water without ever leaving the safety of the dugout. It was a beautiful, elegant loop. I looked at the hole I'd dug, the earth I'd moved, and the glass I'd installed. I wasn't just building a cabin anymore. I was building a life support system. Outside, the Montana winter roared in frustration, but inside the $10 cabin, the math was starting to add up. I gripped the crowbar and stood up. It was time to build the heart. The temperature outside had likely dropped to 20 below, but inside the dugout, the air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and ancient creosote. I began to excavate a secondary pit in the corner of the floor, digging deep into the clay-rich soil. I needed a combustion chamber. I used the rusted sheets of corrugated tin I'd found earlier, bending them into a vertical chimney that would serve as the heat riser. This was the secret of the rocket stove. By insulating the chimney, you created a massive temperature differential that sucked air in with the force of a jet engine, ensuring a complete, smokeless burn. I lined the combustion chamber with flat river stones I'd gathered from the creek bed before the snow got too deep. These stones would act as a thermal mass, soaking up the heat and radiating it back into the dugout long after the fire went out. I threaded the copper tubing around the outside of the tin chimney, creating a coil that would capture the waste heat from the exhaust. One end of the tube led to a small intake funnel I'd fashioned from a plastic bottle, which I positioned directly under a small gap in the roof where the snow would accumulate. The other end led to my water bladder. The physics were simple, but the execution was a struggle. My hands were so cold they felt like wooden blocks, and every movement required a conscious effort of will. But as I tightened the final connection, using a scrap of wire to secure the copper coil, I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just the will to survive. It was the joy of the craft. Thorne had called me a relic, a man out of time. But Thorne didn't know how to make fire from nothing. He didn't know how to turn a pile of trash into a machine. I gathered a handful of dry cedar bark and small splinters of wood I'd shaved from the bridge timber. I struck my last match. The flame flickered, a tiny, fragile spark of gold in the overwhelming grey. I fed it the bark, holding my breath as the smoke curled upward. For a moment, it wavered, the cold air in the chimney threatening to quench it. Then I heard it. A low, hollow whoomph. The rocket stove caught. The draft kicked in, and the fire began to roar, the sound echoing through the tin pipe like a living thing. I sat back, watching the orange glow dance against the wired glass. Within minutes, I felt the first wave of warmth. It wasn't the sterile, forced air heat of a mansion. It was a deep, penetrating radiation that seemed to sink into my very bones. I watched the first few drops of water begin to trickle through the copper tube, clear and steaming. I filled a small tin cup and took a sip. It tasted of copper and earth, but it was the best thing I'd ever tasted. It was the taste of a battle won. I was warm. I was hydrated. And for the first time in a decade, I was truly, completely free. Outside, the world was ending, but inside my $10 cabin, a new one was just beginning. I leaned my head back against the Douglas fir beam and, for the first time since the gavel fell, I slept. The sound that woke me wasn't a noise. It was an absence of it. The high-pitched shriek of the wind, the rhythmic lashing of the snow against the glass, the distant groaning of the ravine's frozen trees. It had all been replaced by a silence so profound, It felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. I opened my eyes, but the darkness was absolute. For a terrifying heartbeat, I thought I'd gone blind, or that the carbon monoxide from my stove had finally claimed me. Then, I saw the faint orange pulse of the embers in the rocket heater, a dying heartbeat in the corner of my vision. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the wired glass. It wasn't cold. It wasn't slick. It felt like nothing. I realized then that the window was gone. Not shattered, but vanished. The snow had risen so fast and so high that it had completely encapsulated the cabin. I was no longer in a dugout. I was in a tomb of white. The blizzard hadn't just arrived. It had consumed the world. The sky, the stars, the jagged rim of the ravine, everything that defined my reality was now buried under 15 feet of wind-packed Montana powder. I sat up, the air in the cabin feeling strangely thick and still. The thermometer on my duffel bag read 68 degrees. The thermal mass of the stones and the insulating properties of the snowpack were working with a efficiency that surpassed my wildest calculations. Outside, the temperature was likely hitting 40 below, a level of cold that shatters steel and turns rubber into glass. But here, 6 feet under the earth and 10 feet under the snow, I was in a tropical microclimate. I fed a few more scraps of cedar to the heater, watching the flames lick the tin pipe. The low roar returned, a comforting mechanical purr. I checked my water bladder. It was full, the copper coil having worked its magic while I slept. I took a long, slow drink, the water warm and revitalizing. I was alive. I was warm. I was the only thing still moving in a frozen universe. But the silence was deceptive. As I sat there, I began to hear it. The deep, subsonic vibration of the earth itself. It was the sound of millions of tons of snow settling, the internal friction of the flakes creating a low-frequency hum that vibrated through my floor. And then, a sharper sound. A snap. A crack, like a rifle shot, muffled by the depth of the burial. It came from somewhere above, toward the rim of the ravine where the old township sat. I knew that sound. It wasn't the sound of a tree breaking. It was the sound of a structural failure, a joint giving way, a weld snapping under the impossible weight of the drifts. Up there, in the world of high-efficiency building codes and architectural vanity, the storm was doing its work. The modern world was built on the assumption of average conditions, on the belief that the 100-year storm was a myth. But I had built for the 1,000-year event. I had built for the apocalypse. I spent the next several hours in a state of hyper-focused maintenance. I monitored the air intake, ensuring the small breathing tube I'd run up the side of the cedar log remained clear of ice. I checked the tension on the Douglas fir beam, feeling for any sign of sag or stress. There was none. The beam was solid, a silent sentinel holding back the weight of a mountain. I was the captain of a submarine made of trash and engineering, navigating the depths of a white ocean. Every few hours, another crack would echo through the ravine. The sounds were closer now, more frequent. I closed my eyes and visualized the map of Bittersweet Creek. I thought of the old water tower, its rusted legs surely buckling under the ice. I thought of the general store, its wide, flat roof a perfect trap for the drifts. And then I thought of the construction site on the ridge, Thorne's signature series luxury condos, the ones he'd been so proud of. They were built with the finest materials money could buy. Lightweight steel, glass fiber insulation, and prefabricated trusses. But lightweight steel has a low thermal inertia. Glass fiber compresses when wet, and prefabricated trusses are only as strong as their weakest gusset plate. Thorne had built for the market. I had built for the physics. I could almost see the steel warping as the temperature differential between the heated interiors and the sub-zero exterior created impossible stresses. I could see the snow piling up on those beautiful modern roofs until the math simply stopped working. The storm was no longer just a weather event. It was a purge. It was a massive atmospheric reset button, erasing the arrogance of a world that thought it had conquered nature. I felt a strange, cold satisfaction. I wasn't just surviving. I was witnessing the vindication of the old ways. I was the last man standing because I was the only one who had respected the enemy. The air in the dugout began to cool slightly as the fire died down. I didn't reach for more wood. I wanted to hear the storm. I wanted to feel the weight of it. I lay back on my bed of cedar branches, the scent of the wood filling my lungs. I was a grain of sand in a desert of ice, a flicker of heat in a void of cold. I was Elias Vance, the bridge builder who had been discarded like trash, and I was currently the safest, warmest, and most alive person in the state of Montana. As I drifted back towards sleep, I heard one final sound. It wasn't a crack or a snap. It was a roar, a massive, cascading wall of sound that vibrated the very floor of my dugout. An avalanche. The north face of the ravine had given way, the sheer weight of the snow overcoming the friction of the slope. The world above me was being reshaped, smoothed over by a white hand. When the sun finally rose, if it ever did, the map of the world would be gone. There would be only the white, the cold, and the man in the hole. I welcomed the silence. I was ready for the siege. The silence lasted for 3 days, or perhaps it was 3 years. In the whiteout of the dugout, time lost its linear shape and became a circular loop of maintenance and meditation. I woke. I fed the fire. I drank the copper-tainted water. I checked the structural load, and I slept. The only clock I had was the rhythmic pulse of the rocket heater and the slow, steady consumption of my cedar wood pile. I was a monk in a cathedral of frozen silt, a witness to the absolute power of the Montana winter. But on the 4th day, the silence was broken by a sound that made the previous cracks seem like whispers. It was a deep, earth-shaking boom, a percussive shockwave that sent a shower of dust down from my ceiling and made the wired glass rattle in its steel frames. It wasn't an avalanche. It was the sound of something engineered being unengineered with violent prejudice. It was the sound of a collapse. I knew exactly what it was. The Miller's Crossing Bridge, not the old one whose bones I'd scavenged, but the new one, Thorne's Efficiency Bridge. It was a pre-stressed concrete span, a marvel of modern cost-cutting, designed to be assembled in a week and last for 50 years. But concrete is a brittle material, and pre-stressing relies on the perfect integrity of the internal steel cables. When the temperature drops to 40 below and stays there for a week, the molecular structure of the steel changes. It becomes glass hard. It becomes prone to brittle fracture. And when the snow loads reach the levels of this storm, pounds per square foot far exceeding the design limits, something has to give. The boom was followed by a series of smaller, screeching sounds, the scream of metal being twisted and torn. I imagined the scene above, the massive concrete girders snapping like dry crackers, the steel cables whipping through the air with enough force to cut through a forest, and the entire structure plunging into the frozen depths of the creek bed. Thorne's shortcut to progress had just been erased by the very physics he thought he'd outsmarted. I felt no joy in the destruction, only a grim professional sadness. A bridge is a sacred thing, a promise made to the land that you can cross it safely. Thorne had broken that promise. He had built for the spreadsheet, not the storm. And now, the town was truly cut off. The bridge was the only way in or out of the valley. With its collapse, Bittersweet Creek was an island in a sea of ice. The collapse triggered a chain reaction of failures. I could hear the city's infrastructure dying. The low hum of the distant power substation, which had been a faint, comforting vibration, suddenly surged into a high-pitched whine before cutting out entirely. The grid had failed. The modern world was officially dark. Up on the ridge, the luxury condos would be losing their heat within minutes. The high-end insulation would slow the process, but without the constant pump of the furnace, the interior temperature would plummet. The pipes would freeze, the drywall would crack, and the occupants, if there were any, would find themselves in a race against the clock. I looked at my rocket stove. It didn't need a grid. It didn't need a furnace. It needed only the chemical energy stored in the wood I'd pulled from the trash. I was the only person in the valley with a functioning heating system, and my fuel source was the very debris the town had discarded. There was a beautiful, savage irony in it. The trash cabin was now the most valuable piece of real estate in the county. I decided to try and clear a small path to the surface. I needed to see the world, and I needed to ensure my air intake was truly secure. I used a scrap of plywood as a makeshift shovel, carving a narrow vertical shaft through the snowpack. The snow was hard, packed into a dense, crystalline structure by the wind. It was like carving through marble. It took me 2 hours of back-breaking labour to reach the surface, my lungs burning from the exertion in the thin, cold air. When I finally broke through the crust, the world that greeted me was unrecognisable. The ravine was gone. In its place was a smooth, undulating landscape of blinding white. The trees were mere humps in the snow, their branches encased in thick grey ice. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, the sun a distant, heatless coin in the firmament. The wind had died down to a bitter, biting breeze that felt like needles against my exposed skin. I looked toward the ridge. The construction site was a scene of devastation. The skeletal remains of the condos were visible through the drifts, their roofs sagging or entirely gone. The scaffolding had collapsed, a twisted mess of yellow metal against the white. And in the distance, I could see the gap in the horizon where the bridge used to be. The valley was silent. No engines, no sirens, no voices, just the wind and the cold. I felt a sudden sharp pang of loneliness. I was the master of my little hole, but I was a king of nothing. The pride I'd felt in my survival was suddenly tempered by the realization of the scale of the catastrophe. How many people were freezing in their homes right now? How many were trapped in their cars, waiting for a rescue that would never come because the bridge was gone? I turned to go back down into the dugout, but something caught my eye. A movement. A tiny dark speck against the vast white expanse of the upper ravine. It was moving slowly, erratically, like an insect struggling through sugar. I pulled my binoculars from my duffel, an old pair of Nikons with cracked lenses, and adjusted the focus. The speck resolved into a figure, a man. He was dressed in a dark coat that looked woefully thin for the conditions. He was stumbling, falling, and dragging himself through the hip-deep snow. He wasn't headed for the town. He was headed for the ravine. He was headed for me. I watched him for several minutes, my heart rate accelerating. I recognized the gait, the desperate, stumbling arrogance of the stride, even in the face of death. It was Marcus Thorne. He had survived the collapse of his condos, but he had nowhere to go. The bridge was down. His luxury SUV was likely buried or out of fuel, and the town was a dark freezer. He was coming to the only place he knew where a man might still be alive. He was coming to the ditch. I felt a surge of anger so hot it made my vision blur. This was the man who had taken my life, who had mocked my work, and who had left me to die in a blizzard. And now, he was coming to me for salvation. Part of me wanted to pull the plywood back over the hole, to seal myself in and let the winter finish what it had started. He deserved the cold. He deserved to feel the weight of the math he'd ignored. But as I watched him fall again, his body disappearing into a drift for several long seconds before he clawed his way back out, the engineer in me took over. A bridge is a promise. A shelter is a promise. You don't build to exclude. You build to protect life, even the lives that don't deserve it. I stood there on the edge of my hole, the wind whipping my beard, and waited. I didn't call out. I didn't wave. I just stood there, a grey ghost in a white world, watching the king of the valley crawl toward the man he'd called a rat. The siege was over. The trial had begun. But before the trial, there was the silence. Before the man reached my door, the Montana winter decided to remind me that it hadn't yet reached its zenith. As I stood at the mouth of my snow shaft, the air didn't just feel cold, it felt corrosive. Every breath was a risk, a dry, freezing intake that felt like inhaling powdered glass. I could feel the moisture on my eyeballs beginning to crystallize, a prismatic blur that turned the white world into a shimmering, distorted hallucination. This was the deep cold, the point where the mercury doesn't just fall, it vanishes. I retreated back down into the dugout, sealing the shaft with the plywood and packing snow around the edges to create a pressure seal. I needed every calorie of heat my little stove could produce. The interior of the cabin had become a study in extremes. Near the rocket heater, the river stones were so hot they glowed with a dull, infrared intensity. But only 3 feet away, near the edges of the cedar log and the granite outcrop, a thick layer of rime had formed. It was beautiful and deadly. Feathery, translucent crystals of ice that grew in long, jagged needles, reaching out toward the center of the room like frozen fingers. The cold was a physical presence now, a heavy, invisible liquid that pooled on the floor and seeped into every crack. I could hear the Douglas fir beam complaining, the wood contracting with a series of sharp, rhythmic, ticking sounds that echoed like a clock in the silence. Even the earth was shrinking. The clay walls of my dugout were developing micro fissures, the moisture in the soil freezing and expanding, then shattering the very structure of the ground. I wrapped myself in my father's old wool blanket, sitting so close to the stove that the smell of singed fabric began to fill the room. I was a man reduced to the most basic biological functions. My heart rate had slowed to a steady, thumping crawl. My digestion had all but stopped. I was a machine for the conservation of heat. I watched the copper tube, the water now a slow, steaming drip, and I realized that I had reached the absolute limit of my engineering. There were no more screws to turn, no more beams to brace. It was just me, the math, and the void. The sensory deprivation of the dugout began to play tricks on my mind. I heard voices in the roar of the heater, the judge's monotone, Thorne's smooth arrogance, the sound of the repo crane. They were ghosts of a world that no longer existed. In here, in the heart of the ravine, the only reality was the heat and the ice. I felt a strange sense of clarity, a stripping away of all the noise of my former life. I wasn't an engineer anymore. I wasn't a victim. I was a biological constant in a changing universe. Outside, the temperature must have hit 50 below. At that level, the air becomes so dense it barely moves. The wind is replaced by a static, crystalline haze that hangs over the landscape. Sound travels for miles, but there is no sound to travel. It is the silence of the moon. It is the point where life simply stops trying. I looked at my hands. They were cracked and stained with grease and earth, the nails blackened by work. They were the hands of a laborer, a man who built things that lasted. Thorne's hands were soft, manicured, designed for the holding of pens and the signing of contracts. His hands were useless here. His world was built on the assumption of a steady state, on the belief that the environment could be managed and controlled by air conditioners and furnace filters. But the deep cold doesn't care about contracts. It doesn't care about building codes. It only cares about the laws of thermodynamics. A bridge is a way to overcome a gap. A house is a way to overcome the cold. I had built both, and I knew that the true strength of a structure isn't in its materials, but in its soul. It's in the intention of the builder. Thorne had built for profit, and his buildings were failing. I had built for survival, and my building was holding. The trash cabin was the only honest structure left in the valley. The hour of the deep cold passed, a slow, agonizing crawl through the heart of the night. I felt the pressure in the room begin to shift, a subtle change in the vibration of the heater. The peak of the storm had passed. The atmosphere was starting to settle, the air losing that sharp electric tension. The world was still frozen, but the killing edge had blunted just a fraction. I stood up, my joints cracking like the timber. I felt a sudden, sharp clarity. Thorne was still out there. If he was still moving, he would be reaching the rim of the ravine by now. He would be seeing the faint orange glow of my air intake, a beacon of heat in a dead world. He would be coming for the only thing left that could save him. I walked to the shaft and pushed against the plywood. It was frozen shut. I had to use the crowbar to break the seal, the ice shattering with a sound like broken glass. I climbed back up to the surface, the air still brutally cold but no longer impossible. The sun was beginning to touch the horizon, casting a long blood-red light across the white expanse. It was a beautiful, terrifying sight, the first light of a new world. And there, only 50 yards away, was the figure of Marcus Thorne. He was no longer walking. He was crawling on his hands and knees, a dark, broken shape against the pristine snow. He had lost his coat. He had lost his boots. He was a man reduced to a primal, desperate animal. He reached the edge of my clearing and looked up. His face was a mask of frostbite, his eyes red and weeping. He didn't see a bridge builder. He didn't see a relic. He saw a god. He saw the man who had fire. I stood at the entrance to my dugout, my arms crossed, the heat from below rising up around me in a shimmering veil. I let him crawl the last few feet. I let him feel the warmth of my breath against the sub-zero air. I let him see the cabin, the steel, the glass, the solid, honest math of it. "Elias," he croaked, the word barely a whisper, a rasp of air through a frozen throat. He reached out a hand, his fingers blackened and curled like claws. "Please." I looked down at him, the man who had taken everything I owned. I thought of the courtroom. I thought of the eviction notice in the mud. I thought of the prime rib at the club. And then I looked at the $10 box of screws, the only thing that had stood between me and the end. The math was simple. The debt was paid. I reached down and took his hand. Dragging Marcus Thorne into the dugout was like hauling a side of frozen beef. His limbs were stiff, his muscles locked in a permanent shivering spasm that made him feel twice his actual weight. I tumbled him down the shaft, the two of us landing in the warm, dusty floor of the cabin. I sealed the plywood overhead, and the silence of the world returned, punctuated only by the low, rhythmic roar of the rocket heater. I didn't speak. I didn't offer him a blanket right away. I wanted him to see. I wanted him to feel the reality of what he had called a ditch. Thorne lay on the dirt floor, his body jerking with the violent onset of rewarming shock. It's a dangerous moment when the cold blood from the extremities rushes back to the heart. I moved with mechanical efficiency, stripping the remains of his silk shirt and wool trousers. His skin was the colour of a winter sky, a pale, translucent blue, marbled with the white patches of deep frostbite on his chest and thighs. I grabbed the water bladder and pressed the warm copper tube to his lips. "Drink," I commanded. My voice sounded alien to me, low, resonant, and filled with authority that had nothing to do with a job title. He choked on the first swallow, the water spilling down his chin. But he grabbed the bladder with a desperate animal strength, guzzling the liquid as if it were the elixir of life. As the warmth began to penetrate his core, the shivering subsided, replaced by a deep, guttural moaning. He looked around the cabin, his eyes wide and unfocused, darting from the glowing river stones to the massive Douglas fir beam, then to the wired glass windows that were still encased in their shroud of snow. What is this place?" he whispered, his voice a pathetic rasp. "It's a $10 cabin, Marcus," I said, sitting back against the cedar log. I picked up a piece of the bridge timber and began to shave a few splinters off with my knife. "Built from the garbage you threw away, held together by the screws I bought with my last $10. He looked at the stove, the tin pipe radiating a steady, shimmering heat. He looked at the copper tubing, the source of the water that had just saved his life. He looked at the walls of frozen earth, which felt as solid and permanent as a fortress. "The condos," he started, his voice cracking. "They're gone, Elias. The roof, the main truss just snapped, like it was made of toothpicks. The whole north wing collapsed into the parking garage. I was in the trailer. The wind. It rolled the trailer like a tin can. I barely got out." "I know," I said, my voice devoid of pity. "I heard the math failing from 3 miles away." "It shouldn't have happened," he said, a flash of his old arrogance flickering in his eyes before being snuffed out by a fresh wave of pain. We used the best materials. The engineering was certified. The inspector was looking at a clipboard, Marcus. He wasn't looking at the sky. He was looking at the profit margins, not the shear loads. I leaned forward, the light from the stove casting long, distorted shadows across my face. You built for a world that stays at 72 degrees. You built for a world that never stops moving. But the world stopped, Marcus. And when it stopped, your best materials turned into liabilities. Your steel was too thin. Your glass was too large. Your trusses were too complex. You ignored the physics of the land you were standing on. He looked at the floor, his head sagging. The king of the valley was sitting in a hole in the ground, naked and shivering, being lectured by a man he'd tried to erase. The irony was so thick it was almost tangible, a heavy metallic scent in the air. I thought I could control it, he whispered. I thought money could buy anything, even the weather. Money buys comfort, Marcus. It doesn't buy survival. Survival is earned. It's earned by respecting the enemy. It's earned by knowing the difference between a building and a shelter. I finally threw him the wool blanket. He clutched it to his chest, burying his face in the scratchy, cedar-scented fabric. He looked small. He looked old. The $3,000 suit was gone, replaced by the grime of my floor. The cologne was gone, replaced by the smell of smoke and wet earth. He was just a man, stripped of his titles and his ledger, facing the absolute reality of the Montana winter. I'm going to lose everything, he said, his voice hollow. The bridge, the condos, the lawsuits will be endless. The bank will foreclose by the end of the week. Then you'll be exactly where I was 4 days ago, I said. On the curb, clutched by the wind. Only you don't have a bag of tools, Marcus, and you don't have $10 for a box of screws. He looked up at me then, and for the first time, I saw it. The revelation. Not just the fear of loss, but the realization of his own emptiness. He had built a kingdom on sand, and the tide had finally come in. He had mocked the man who built bridges, and now he was the one stranded on the wrong side of the gap. Elias, he said, his voice trembling. What am I going to do? I looked at the stove, then back at the man. I thought of the bridge that had collapsed. I thought of the world that would need to be rebuilt when the snow finally melted. You're going to stay here, I said. You're going to keep the fire going while I sleep. You're going to learn the difference between a screw and a nail. And when the sun comes up tomorrow, you're going to help me dig out the air intake. Why? He asked. Why help me? I took your home. I tried to kill you. Because a bridge is a promise, Marcus, I said, lying back and closing my eyes. And I'm a bridge builder, even when the person on the other side doesn't deserve the crossing. The night that followed was the longest of the siege. The storm, as if sensing its prey, was slipping away, threw one final desperate tantrum. The wind returned with a vengeance, but now it was a dry, hollow howl, the sound of a predator that had lost the scent. Inside the dugout, the air remained a steady, humid warmth. Thorne sat by the stove, his eyes reflecting the orange glow of the embers. He didn't move. He didn't sleep. He watched the fire as if it were the last light in the universe. As the first grey light of dawn began to seep through the snow shaft, a new sound reached us. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the earth. It was a rhythmic, mechanical thumping. A helicopter. I stood up, my muscles stiff but functional. I climbed the shaft and pushed the plywood aside. The world above was a blinding, diamond-white desert. The sky was a clear, impossible blue. And there, hovering over the ridge, was a bright red search and rescue bird. It was circling the ruins of the condos, its spotlight cutting through the crisp morning air. I grabbed a piece of the rusted tin and used it as a signal mirror, catching the first rays of the sun. Within minutes, the helicopter banked, the roar of its rotors growing deafening as it descended into the ravine. It landed 50 yards away, its skids sinking into the deep powder. 2 men in heavy flight suits jumped out, their boots crunching through the crust. They were carrying medical kits and emergency blankets. They stopped 10 feet from the mouth of my dugout, their eyes wide with disbelief. They looked at the wired glass windows, the massive Douglas fir beam, and the faint plume of smoke rising from the snow. "Is anyone alive down there?" one of them shouted over the roar of the engine. I stepped out, the cold air hitting me like a physical blow, but I didn't flinch. I was the master of the ravine. "2 of us," I said, my voice steady, "but one of them is going to need a lot of help." They followed me down into the dugout. They saw Thorne, wrapped in the wool blanket, sitting on the dirt floor. They saw the rocket heater, the copper tubing, and the 5-pound box of screws. They saw the engineering of survival. "My God," the lead medic whispered, looking around the small, warm sanctuary. "We've been flying for 4 hours. The town is a disaster zone. The bridge is gone, the shelters are freezing, and the condos on the ridge. There's nothing left. How did you stay warm?" I looked at Thorne, who was looking at the medics with the expression of profound, silent shame. He didn't say a word. He didn't claim credit. He didn't try to buy his way out. He just sat there, a relic of a world that had failed. "We had the math," I said, picking up the box of screws. "And we had the garbage. It turns out that's all you really need." As they loaded Thorne onto a stretcher, he finally looked at me. His eyes were clear now, the frostbite starting to heal, but the look in them was something I would never forget. It was respect. Genuine, hard-earned respect. "Elias," he said, as they began to lift him toward the surface. "The golf course, the 8th hole." "Yeah?" I asked. "Build the bridge," he whispered. "Build it like you built this. Build it to last 100 years. I watched the helicopter lift off, its rotors kicking up a cloud of snow that looked like falling stars. I watched it disappear over the ridge, taking the man who had tried to destroy me toward a future he didn't yet understand. I was alone again in the ravine, but I wasn't the man who had walked into it 4 days ago. I was the man who had built a throne out of trash. I looked at the dugout, the small, honest structure that had defied the apocalypse. I looked at the $10 box of screws, now nearly empty. The moral of the story isn't that the world is a dangerous place. It's that the things we build define who we are. If you build for the market, you'll fall with the market. If you build for the spreadsheet, you'll break with the spreadsheet. But if you build for the physics, if you build with respect for the land and the materials, you'll survive the storm. I picked up my shovel and began to clear the snow from the wired glass. The sun was high now, the warmth of it finally reaching the floor of the ravine. The spring was coming, and when it arrived, I had a bridge to build. I listened to his shallow, shivering breath for a long time. I listened to the sound of the storm, now a distant, harmless hum. And then, for the second time in the ravine, I slept. But this time, I didn't dream of blueprints or courtrooms. I dreamt of the spring. I dreamt of the sound of running water and the smell of the earth waking up. I dreamt of a world where the things we built were as honest as the ground they stood on.